Welcome everyone. My name is Kirsten Olson. I'm the workshop coordinator here at Minnesota Center for Book Arts. I use she, her pronouns. We're so glad to have you join us this evening for our artist panel working with Hebrew and Yiddish Type. The panel is curated by Robyn Awend and moderated by Schiff and features local and national artists who use both traditional and contemporary Hebrew and Yiddish Type in their work. Minnesota Center for Book Arts is a nonprofit book arts organization whose mission is to ignite artistic practice, inspire learning, and foster diverse creative communities through the book arts. We do this by creating access to specialized book arts tools, equipment, and knowledge, supporting interdisciplinary artistic development, expanding opportunities for people who have been historically underrepresented in the field, and presenting exhibitions and educational programs that create connections around the art of the book, promote innovation, and advance the future of the field. I also want to note that the registration fees only make up a portion of the cost to present our workshops, and so I want to acknowledge that this activity is made possible by a grant provided by the Minnesota State Arts Board through an appropriation by the Minnesota State Legislature and a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts. Without further delay, I would like to introduce Robyn Awend. She is serving as a fellow this year at MCBA, creating programming through the initiative History in the Making, focusing on our newly commissioned Hebrew wood type. Robyn is a community builder and Twin Cities-based artist using words and word fragments to inform her letterpress prints and mixed media installations.
Thank you, Kirsten, and thank you to MCBA for this very exciting partnership. Tonight's artist talk is being presented as part of History in the Making, which is a year-long series of programs and events exploring the historical and contemporary printed word in Jewish culture and activating MCBA's newly acquired Hebrew wood type. This type, commissioned by MCBA, and created by Hamilton Wood Type and Printing Museum, is the only Hebrew wood type in the country to be manufactured and made available for public use. This unique community resource enables Twin Cities communities to connect with Jewish culture and identity in creative new ways. History in the Making is made possible in part with the support of the Noah F. Gordon Fund at the Minneapolis Foundation, Ramon, the Minnesota Jewish Arts Council, an initiative of the Minneapolis Jewish Federation, the Lerner Foundation, Phil and Tammy Rosenblum, and J Create, an initiative of Jewfolk Incorporated. Typically, type comes with decades of unknown or little known provenance. However, with the commissioning of new type, we as a community get the unique opportunity to build new type history together, print by print, sharing stories, ideas, and new work along the way and across the globe. We are so honored and delighted to have 4 amazing panelists as part of our conversation this evening. We have Noam Sienna joining us locally, Shani Avni joining us from New York, Gabriella Boros, based in Illinois, but joining us from the Catskills this evening, and Lynne Avadenka joining us from Michigan. Each of these artists uses Hebrew text in their work in interesting, innovative, and unique ways. We will hear from each of these artists about their work, their process, and about how the Hebrew language has found its way into their art making. Moderating this panel of distinguished artists is Schiff, joining us from Texas. Karen is an artist, writer, and editor who often works in the zone between word and image. She is an MFA with honors in drawing from the School of the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, and Tufts University, and a PhD in comparative literature and literary theory from the University of Pennsylvania. Artist residencies include Yaddo, Anderson Ranch, and the Edward F. Albee Foundation. Her drawings have been shown and collected, and her writing has been published on both sides of the Atlantic. Karen, I will turn our evening over to you.
Thanks so much, Robyn. And thank you also to the Minnesota Center for Book Arts for hosting this event and for making Robyn's residency possible. It's been great to talk with her about this event and to see how she's been making the most of her opportunity in her own practice, as well as benefiting the institution and the community at large. And that includes her reaching out to me to moderate this panel, which she could have skillfully done so well herself. But she was interested in expanding the conversation. So I hope that I can help with that. First, I'll be laying out some conceptual stakes in using Hebrew as part of image making, and also sharing resources that I have encountered along the way as I've been interested in these questions myself. I'll be sharing the URLs in the presentation that I will share with you now, so that you can explore them if you go back to the YouTube presentation of this event. Meanwhile, my light, there's no technical problem. I just might have to stand and wave my arms a little bit to get them to go back on. So I was especially interested in this topic because I have a longstanding interest in the Hebrew alphabet, in part because I've always been a wonk for typography. I grew up drawing the letters in a letter set catalog that my father, a graphic designer, brought home from the office. So long ago, I was enchanted by books such as this one on the left, and also got curious about how the Hebrew alphabet actually had significance that was unlike the alphabet of Latin, the Latin alphabet. Here are some resources for exploring that. Also, I became interested in exploring sofrut or ritual scribal arts. On the top are some people I met along the way in that inquiry. This gets into feminist issues fast, which might come up in some of our conversations, but that's another story. In the Torah, the letters are seen as material instantiations or perhaps emanations of the divine. And because of the spiritual power of the Hebrew letters that are scribed in this way, in ritualistic ways, a Torah scroll can actually stand in for a human being when one additional person is needed to constitute a minyan or group of 10 people for some observances, such as a recitation of the prayer for the dead. The letters of Hebrew can also stand for numbers. Hebrew uses letters for numbers like in Roman numerals. And so one type of Torah interpretation creates meaning through what's called gematria, or reflecting on how words are conceptually connected if their letters add up to the same numerical value. It's sort of like homonyms, but with numbers instead of sounds. Also, the Hebrew letters can actually stand, the 4 Hebrew letters that are the tetragrammaton for holy name of God can stand for a picture of the human body. Curiously, these diagrams often show up in sites for Christian and even Zoroastrian contexts. It's not just about Jewish Hebrew. But also, the letters can be used to make pictures in other ways because of the second commandment in the 10 Commandments talking about prohibition against what are called graven images, and there's lots of debate about what that might mean. And I have a personal riff on that, but one traditional way around this is to use letters to make images in micrographia. And here's an example of using letters as line, letters as pattern, letters as shape. And though I have never experimented with micrographia, these ideas about how the letter can become an image have interested me a lot. And one way that I've experimented with that, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of technical difficulty here. is to look into Sefrit on my own with the help of these resources that I listed on the right, but then also experimenting with actually expanding the shapes of Hebrew letters. This is just the aleph, and then into an abstraction. This is a field made of only the letter aleph. This is more along the lines of what I usually do because I'm interested in geometric abstraction. But it also sort of subdues the Hebrew content of the letters, which is intriguing to me, and I'm interested in talking with all of the people on the panel about the question that they found most interesting, which was about how it is important to them that viewers of their work are aware of the Hebrew content and perhaps its meaning. This is another way that the content is subdued. These shapes are made by connecting the dots of punctuation at the ends of paragraphs. And these are in 3 drafts of a Torah commentary I wrote on Genesis 1:1. So how does the paragraphing in the different drafts affect the shape that results from connecting the dots of punctuation? Or perhaps reconfiguring how the pages are laid out for each of those 3 drafts and then performing the same operation in different ways. These are just ways that I've been experimenting recently. And it relates to ways that I've connected the dots in the O's or other vowels in earlier projects, also to make shapes, which most recently relate to the research I've been doing on Picasso. This is sewing together those dots of punctuation at the ends of paragraphs in a review of a book on Picasso. But actually all of these relate very much to the connecting of dots that comes in the Sephirotic tree. I wanted to also give people resources for how to unpack what that could mean. And it shows up on Etsy on the top right in a pendant, but this is all connected to the Kabbalah or mystical teachings of how the universe is actually constructed. And I actually also wanted to say at the top that one of the unique qualities of Hebrew letters is their relationship to creativity, in the sense that Kabbalistically or mystically, it's said that the world was actually created through a divine utterance. So the phrase from the beginning of the Torah where, and God said, let there be light, and there was light. The interpretation, or one interpretation of that, is that the letters themselves in the utterance became the building blocks of the cosmos. So that's a very interesting dimension to have weaving into the practice of using Hebrew letters in the creation of art altogether. So that's a pretty deep dive into the Jewish contexts. I also wanted to say that this panel in particular is mixing that context with a secular and public institution in a really interesting way. So now I want to give you 2 resources to explore in the coming days and weeks that also put these things together. This is some artwork that you can see is if you're in Minneapolis this coming weekend. But also, no matter where you are, there's a Zoom presentation coming up with Toby Khan, a Jewish artist in New York, who is talking about words as image as part of a Zoom series he's holding through the Jewish Community Foundation, although the artwork he'll be talking about is generally by artists in the contemporary art community who are not particularly identifying in terms of Jewish traditions. So these are examples of how there's a kind of intersection of Jewish and general considerations about art, and also some examples of how Hebrew letters can function in an unusual way. I just want to mention also that all of the examples of Toby's artwork that I'm showing you now are topically relevant because they look to me like characters in terms of images of letters, but they are not. They are the 49 numbers of the Omer, which is the 49-day period between Passover and Shavuot, which is the next major Jewish holiday. And so we are in that period of the Omer right now. So I thought it was interesting to share these examples of artworks that are reflecting on these particular days as characters themselves. So what I'm going to do now is start introducing each of the artists. Each of them will give a presentation of their own work, and we'll talk in general about some questions, but meanwhile, you're welcome to start putting your own questions in the chat as we go along. So our first artist is Lynne. She's an American artist maker whose art is exhibited and collected internationally. Awards include the 2021 Isaac Anolik Artist Book Award and a 2019 Research Award from the Hadassah Brandeis Institute. Residencies and teaching opportunities have taken her to Germany, Israel, Italy, and many states in the US. In 2013, she was named director of Signal Return, a Detroit nonprofit letterpress print shop and community arts center. And in August 2021, she was artist in residence at the Cary Graphic Arts Collection of the Rochester Institute of Technology.
Thank you.
Lynne.
Thank you. I'm really glad to be here with all these people whose work I'm going to learn about, and some I already know and admire. And thank you to Robyn for inviting me. We go back quite a ways, and our interest in Hebrew type has continued. So it's exciting that she made this happen in Minneapolis. So I'm going to share my screen, I think. We'll find out. And start by, I'm going to show you 3 different ways of working with Hebrew type. This first one is an artist book that I did in 2001, a collaborative work with an Islamic calligrapher, Mohammed Zakaria. Some of you may know his work from the stamp that's issued at Eid by the Postal Service. It's a beautiful gold and blue stamp, but we met and we decided to look for the commonalities in our interest in calligraphy and our traditions. And so this book is a result of that. The title of the book is Root Words, with the idea that Arabic and Hebrew are both 3-letter root word construction. And then this whole idea that language is the root of the problem and the way to solve the problem. So let's see if this advances. Oh, good. We decided on 7 words that we thought were very loaded and important. This one you see is human being, but we also chose language, trust, student, book, wisdom, and then the last word is sky, sort of open-ended. Mohammed did the calligraphy on the left, and I did the Hebrew on the right. His work is really mostly about sacred texts. So this was the first time he had done something secular, and in fact chose a secular calligraphic style for the work that he did. So the text here is the history of the 2 languages and the alphabets, and then the 7 words that I mentioned, and then on the opposite sides of where the words are quotes from Islamic and Judaic sources about letters and the power of calligraphy. And then the opposite pages have Hebrew and Arabic letters together, sort of coexisting on the page. The next work is called World Book, and this was created as a result of an invitation to participate in an exhibition in San Francisco at the Contemporary Jewish Museum. I think it was called New Works, Old Stories, Artists Interpret the Seder Plate. So on this cardboard globe that I had sitting around in my studio, I hand lettered the entire Haggadah. So starting at the top and swirling around, and then the globe opens up and actually the text breaks right when it's time for the festive meal. And inside is a matzah tray and a Seder plate. So Karen mentioned something, and I just want to add this quote to the conversation. It is wonderful, wrote Gertrude Stein, how a handwriting which is illegible can be read. Oh, yes, it can. So I think I've had a lot of people who don't read Hebrew, who aren't Jewish, who just look at this as a kind of a, you know, an interesting object for them to see, where the text becomes in a way like the image. The next series are some letterpress created prints using things from the type case. So things that might have been used in advertising. So for the printers here, it's type high rule and ornaments. And then there's Hebrew type in here. I've been researching the role of Jewish women in early Hebrew printing, and they were there from the beginning, working alongside their husbands and sons and brothers, and then taking over when they had to. So when Hebrew printing first came around, everybody was quite suspicious of it. And David Gans, who was a historian and an astronomer in 1592, was trying to convince people that the invention of printing was something really pretty amazing. And so he said it was one of the great inventions of the world, Tahvula Rabbah. So that there is type that's embedded in some of these that says Tahvula Rabbah, a wonderful invention. And then in another colophon that we know about, there was no word for printing at the beginning. They thought it was done with many pens. So this is a little bit in English from that colophon. Without a pen, my imprint is received. Without a scribe, I was composed on the tablet. I think it's also the word for notebook, machberet. In a moment, ink flows over me. So these are a few examples of these prints that I've been working on. And I should say that the Hebrew type that I'm using was designed by Francesca Baruch, who was a German-Israeli type designer and came to Israel in like the 30s. If you look at the logo for Haaretz, that's her work, and she did all kinds of things for the Postal Service. But this typeface that I've been using is of her design. And the larger letters are actually wood type that I have in my studio. And then, because I always like to know how things are made, this is the angle chase that I've been using. So originally this was used in advertising or working on the press. If you wanted to set something on an angle, you would be able to turn this thing. So this is the setup for the one I just showed you. So you can see I've got curved type and type in a circle and a little lamed on the bottom. And so the way I do these is that I print once and then turn the whole disc and then print again. It's kind of like a spirograph, and it's as fun as a spirograph. This is type that I recently came into my possession. A printer who doesn't work with Hebrew type saw an advertisement for some type in San Francisco. It was a woman named Frederica Portman, who printed a while ago in San Francisco. And I think when she passed, this guy rescued the type. So I just bought it. It's incomplete, but just to show you metal type ready to be used, which I will use in some of those experiments I just showed you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to mention, if folks are curious, the word lamed that Lynn used to refer to something that's at the bottom is the Hebrew letter that sounds like an L. And next we are hearing from Noam Sienna, who's a historian of Jewish culture in the medieval and early modern periods, focusing on the Mediterranean and North Africa, with a particular interest in book history. He received his PhD from the University of Minnesota, and he's currently a junior fellow of the Andrew W. Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, which is part of the Rare Book School at the University of Virginia. He's also a Hebrew calligrapher and illuminator, and his work has been exhibited at the Minnesota JCC, Jewish Community Center, and at the Minnesota Center for Book Arts, and it has been acquired for private collections around the world. Noam.
Thank you so much. I'm, oops, put this up here. Okay, does that look good? I want to echo Lynn's words of thanks and gratitude to the MCBA and to Robyn for pulling this together. I'm really thrilled to be joining this group. And as you just heard from Karen, the topic of my academic research, including my forthcoming book, is on early modern Jewish printing and book history, focusing on the Sephardi world. And I'm also a working Hebrew calligrapher. And so I'm going to try in my few minutes to combine those two hats and whiz through a very abbreviated tour of the development of Hebrew lettering and typography, and talk very briefly about my own work. And of course, I could talk at much greater length about any of these things, so I hope we'll get to return in the question period to these topics. So the development of Hebrew calligraphy and letter art, which I would define specifically as script in which the letters are purposefully shaped to express an aesthetic ideal, so writing beautifully on purpose, not just writing however you write, goes back certainly at least to the early Middle Ages, when Jewish communities around the world developed their own recognizable styles of Hebrew calligraphy and lettering, often in conversation with the visual traditions and landscape around them. So for example, on the top left, you see a classic medieval Ashkenazi script from the mid-13th century, which has a number of formal relationships to the styles of Gothic Latin lettering that were being developed around the same time in the same place in Germany in the 13th century. So these forms are in conversation with each other. Medieval Hebrew manuscripts are often celebrated, and I think rightfully so, as the pinnacle of Jewish letter art and book art and Hebrew calligraphy. And there's certainly, I could spend many, many hours speaking about medieval manuscript art, but since we're here primarily to talk about type, I want to say a few words about Hebrew printing, picking up on what Lynn already shared. So Hebrew printing began not long after movable type printing in Europe in general, and it's certain that there were Hebrew books being printed already in the 1470s in Italy, although we actually don't know what the first printed Hebrew book was or when it was printed. But by the year 1500, Hebrew printing was well established across Italy, Iberia, and the Ottoman Empire, and in the following centuries spread throughout Northern and Eastern Europe as well. Like with Christian books, Hebrew early printed books, which are referred to as incunabula, were initially designed to look like manuscript books, which at the time were not manuscript books, they were just books, since the only kind of books that people knew until then. So the typefaces and lettering for Hebrew books reflected the various styles of script in different communities. So Ashkenazi typefaces, Sephardi, Italian, etc. One which you can see on the screen, including both square script and semi-cursive styles of script, which most of which have died out today, except the script that we call Rashi. Why it's called Rashi script even though it has no connection to Rashi, is a question I would be happy to answer later in the question period. So one unique aspect of early modern books is that their production was rooted in collaboration between Jewish and non-Jewish communities. Perhaps the outstanding example is the Christian printer Daniel Bomberg in Venice, who invested considerable resources in the development of Hebrew type based on the finest Italian Hebrew script of his time. And it paid off because already in his lifetime, his editions of Jewish books, which were produced with the assistance of Jewish typesetters, correctors, and editors, became the standard reference works for both Jews and Christians. For example, his edition of the Babylonian Talmud, which was the first full printed edition of the Talmud, became the standard layout for the Talmud, and its pagination is still the pagination that's used for the Talmud to this day. So if you reference something in the Talmud, Beitzah 12b, you're referring to the page number that it holds in the Bomberg 1521 edition. A century or so later, the Jewish scholar Manasseh ben Israel in Amsterdam had commissioned a Sephardi scribe named Michael Yehuda Leon to design a new Hebrew typeface for the Hebrew press that he opened in Amsterdam in 1629. This new style of type, which became known as Amsterdam letters or Otiot Amsterdam, was so popular that it quickly overtook the other pre-existing styles of Hebrew typefaces. And even books produced outside of Amsterdam, and even books that were written by hand, advertised that they were printed or written in Otiot ke Amsterdam, letters like Amsterdam or Amsterdam style letters. To this day, most standard Hebrew fonts, including, I think, our own new type at MCBA, are still based on the aesthetic style established by this typeface. By the way, I should just say that Hebrew type is not only used for Hebrew language, but of course, any Jewish language or vernacular can be printed with Hebrew letters, and the spread of print contributed greatly to the development of vernacular Jewish literature in Judeo-Arabic, Judeo-Spanish, and Yiddish. Again, a topic that we could speak at much greater length about, but I've just given you some examples here. And of course, there's much more to say about the development of Hebrew typography in the 18th and 19th centuries, and especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, and perhaps Shani will speak to that in a moment. So in my last minute, I just want to share about my own work with Hebrew letters. My academic work has consistently inspired my artistic practice as a Hebrew calligrapher, although I have yet to try my hand at printing with Hebrew type myself. I'm part of why I'm very excited for this MCBA initiative. The guiding principle of my work as a scribe is to ask, how can I learn from historical traditions, apply them to contemporary contexts, and invest them with contemporary meaning? So this might mean recreating medieval materials and techniques, such as cutting my own reed pens and making my own paint from ground earth pigments, as well as immersing myself in the art of the past by attempting to recreate it and adapt it myself. Making art that brings history back to life is one of my great joys. And for me, studying these historical pieces so closely and attempting to match what my eyes see with what my hands can produce is an opportunity to learn from the masters of the past and essentially to be their apprentice, which I feel is a great privilege, although I still have a long way to go. Perhaps after another millennium of practice, or maybe just a few centuries, I will be able to call them colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, we have Gabriella Boros, who was born in Jerusalem to Holocaust survivors. The family moved to the US for her father's postdoctoral studies, and Gabriella earned her degree at the University of Michigan School of Art. She has exhibited her woodblock prints nationally and internationally, and her art also is collected around the world. She was chosen to participate in 2 fellowships, the Spertus Museum's Midwest Artists Lab, and as an Artist Week Fellow by the Amen Institute. She is also the recipient of a State of Illinois Artist Grant. Gabriella.
Thank you. I also want to thank everyone for including me in this group. And I'll just plunge right in. I was a painter for many, many years. And I went to Italy about 10 years ago, and I saw a woodblock show. During my painting career, I never incorporated any type whatsoever in my work. And immediately upon starting with woodblock prints, it became part of my practice to include typography. And specifically, since I was focusing on my faith-based art, Judaic art, it was in Hebrew. I was born in Israel, and so my first language was Hebrew. My first alphabet was Hebrew. And so it's really, for me, it was really an easy kind of mind switch to immediately just start working in Hebrew. Of course, when you're doing woodblock prints, everything you're doing is reversed. And so it took me a couple of prints to figure that out, having to recut things and figure out that, no, you have to really do it backwards. So what we're looking at here is a series, part of a series that I did of the 4 daughters, transposing the 4 sons from the Passover Seder to daughters. And this is one of the first series that I did in woodblock. And I think that Noam would probably agree that this is the Amsterdam version of my Judaic typography here. So it's a little bit heavier. I think it's a little bit clumsier than the later work. This is the second in that series. I did 4 of them. But really, it gave it, I think that the typography here was really trying to stay in keeping with the image itself and emphasize this kind of simplicity and this kind of very blocky style that at that point I was doing in my artwork. A few years later, I did a book of 18 elements of fire in Judaism. And this is the cover of the book, Esh, Sanctity and Fire. And I think that what was important for me here was to show how the image, the letters are rising from and included in the fire. It was very much of a piece. It was very much of the composition. It was very important that these letters be look very strong and contemporary, and the English type reflected those letters. So kind of a sans serif look. And then one of the prints in Ish is this idea of the Torah was written with black fire on white fire. And so down here, you can see there's the Bet, there's the Resh, Aleph, Shin, Yud, and Taf. So I created fire letters and then the white, the smoke up at the top. And I really love this imagery of this playing with the positive and the negative that you can always do with your woodblock prints. And I usually just print in black and white. For me, Passover Seder has been an unbelievable font of inspiration. The Mi Yodea Chad Mi Yodea series I did took the concepts of each question, who knows one, I know one of the Passover songs at the end of the meal, and each one had a botanical element to represent it. So here we have Sidrei Mishnah, and so you have this six-lobed seed pod. And again, the typography that I chose was contemporary. It was something that I felt was very reflective of this style of cutting. So much thinner, it was much more refined than my first attempts. And again, a continuation of that was in the same, and this was in the same format, was the Chad Gadya, which is this last song that we sing. in the Seder, and here it is, the Nashach Leshonra, you have the dog biting the cat, and then here in the background, you have the stick. And I think that the stick and the dog, the cat's tail, all kind of intimate the typography that I'm using down below it. And finally, I did this series after the passing of my mother was very sudden. And I requested to be part of the Tahara ceremony for my mother. And it was very moving for me that I was able to escort my mother to the next Olam Haba. And the ceremony involves a lot of counting, and we count in Hebrew, Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Daled, and we use ksharim, we use knots and shards, and I really felt like it was the most immersive kind of ceremony I'd ever gone through, and I really wanted this kind of tie to the very first letters that my mother taught me to be in this piece. And so the letters go back to being very blocky. The very first letters that you draw when you're a little kid have no ornamentation. They're the simplest that you can make. And this is what I did here with this piece. Thank you very much for letting me share my work.
Thank you. And again, I'm thinking about translating a little bit for folks who might not be as familiar. Olam Haba, I'm thinking, is like the world to come or the next world. Would you translate it in another way as well?
That's correct.
Okay. Last, not least, is Shani Avni, who's the Ismar David Visiting Assistant Curator at the Cary Graphic Arts Collection of the Rochester Institute of Technology since 2020. She holds a BA in Graphic Design from Shenkar College in Israel and an MA in Typeface Design from the University of Reading in England. For her thesis, she began researching the David Hebrew typeface family, and this project is ongoing. She designs, researches, teaches, consults, writes, and lectures on Hebrew type design and typography. Shani.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for letting me share my work. I will also share my screen. Okay, so I was born and raised in Israel, and growing up, I was surrounded by Hebrew and by Israeli visual language, which I often found frustrating. I felt that it was one of survival. It was crude, it was chaotic, it was improvised and lacking cohesion. And I mostly expressed this frustration as a graphic design student through Hebrew letters and lettering. And after working as a graphic designer in Tel Aviv for almost a decade, I began my journey into type design and started the type design master's program in Reading University in the UK. And I was, during this very intensive year, finally got the foundation I was missing. With access to historical resources, I studied in great depth the development of the Latin printing and type making. And at the same time, I independently researched the Hebrew script and its very harsh transition into movable type. And the more I learned, the less frustrated I became with Hebrew typography. With an understanding of the context, of the history, the politics, the technology, and much more, I slowly understood why Hebrew typography looks the way it does, and how it really tells the story of the script, the language, the people. And it was in Reading when I first saw the comprehensive David Hebrew typeface family designed by Ismar David. So this whole typeface family I saw for the very first time. And I decided to focus on David Hebrew for my master's dissertation. And I learned how David created this groundbreaking design, how he tackled many typographic problems, and how he basically proved that Hebrew type can perform better when well designed. And this is how I started working with the Ismar David archive, housed at the RIT Cary Graphic Arts Collection. And in 2017, I was chosen as a research fellow and continued my research into David's work, which is infinite. And just a few words about the Cary. It is one of the world's premier libraries on graphic communication history and practices. And the library holds over 45,000 volumes and over 130 archival collections, ranging from cuneiform, medieval manuscripts, different printing techniques, all the way to contemporary book art. So basically everything with letters that your heart desires. And specifically, the Cary's technology collection focuses on preserving the heritage of letterpress printing and maintains working presses and all the additional equipment that is needed for printing. So during my fellowship and with guidance from our curator and master printer, Amelia Fontanelle, I was able to typeset and print a specimen of David Hebrew, which was fundamental for my research. And since 2020, I've been the Ismar David assistant curator, and I have the privilege of working and teaching with various rare historical collections and facilitate the access to them. And the major project that I'm invested in is our Hebrew and Yiddish wood type collections of about 40 sets of type that we acquired in 2014. So I was very busy processing, researching, cataloging this large collection and converting the letters into archival objects. They are now fully accessible for printing, teaching, research, and all the information is available online, both in a finding aid and in our digital collection, as you can see here. These are all files that everyone is invited to look at, download, work with. They are all online for everyone to access. Our motto at the Cary Press Room is preservation through use. And I'm filled with joy every time our treasures are shared and are actively used in a variety of the programs that we offer, such as research fellowship and artist residency. And you can see here Lynne giving her talk. She was the first artist in residence that we hosted that worked with the Hebrew collection right after it was ready to be used. During COVID, Amelia Fontanelle managed to host online printing demonstrations and classes. And very recently, we are finally able to do it in person with students and members of our local community. And just to wrap up, I feel that the most important part of my research is understanding how to design better Hebrew type after working with this historical type and printing with it and understanding it. And the most important part of my work in the Cary collection is making typographic historical resources accessible to anyone who can benefit from them. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. What we're going to do now is have a general discussion among all of the artists, and I have some general questions. Meanwhile, if any of you have questions for any of them or for all of them, you're welcome to write them in the chat, and we'll get to your questions as we go along. So one of the things that caught my ear when Noam was talking was about the combination of the historical and the contemporary, sort of mining scribal history or book history in Jewish context for historical content, and then somehow making it contemporary. And I'm wondering how all of you are thinking about that, if at all. Like, what is it about the history that you're trying to maintain contact with, and what are you trying to do next with it? Noam, let's talk, if we can start with you, since
Sure.
you're thinking about that question.
Sure, it's such a great question, and I really think it is a thread that runs through all of our work. I think I would say for me, I'll say two things in terms of what I want to preserve. For me, it's actually an exercise in learning and listening. Like, I find that I actually can't. I mean, this relates to something that Shani said, that in order to understand, the resources that I have as a Jewish artist and as someone who works with Hebrew letters, like, it won't make sense unless I really try to immerse myself in the history of how these forms developed and in the kind of alternate paths that didn't evolve in the way that other things did. So, for me, for example, going back to like the medieval manuscript, the illumination, I'm so drawn to the ways in which color and light and text and image are interwoven on the page in a way that until very recently printed books and typography were not really able to capture in the same way. And so, I love thinking about that in my work. And to the second half of your question, I think it's really important for me to not blindly fetishize or kind of just reproduce the past as like the only site of authenticity. And so a lot of like one of the projects that I did that I put some pictures up of is of a ketubah project where I took historical ketubot and I recreated by hand all of the ornament and decoration and calligraphy that surrounded the text. But I didn't write the text. The central actual text of the ketubah, which is what documents the marriage, the couple and the time and place. And I did that so that those frames could actually be reused for contemporary ketubot. And in fact, many of them, I think maybe two-thirds of them already, so people bought them and I filled them out. And so now they've become actual living ketubot. And the couples that the ketubot are now for, there are, same-sex couples. There are couples where one partner has converted to Judaism. There are couples who are living in places and ways that in the 14th or 15th or 17th century would not have been imaginable in terms of what Jewish life looks like. So it's important to me that my work reflect, that we are living in the contemporary world, but we're returning to the past as if I can borrow a phrase from queer theory, as a field of possibility. The past is a field of possibility for us to find building blocks for possible new futures.
It makes me think of queering the tradition, also, to use a term from that field. Yeah.
Karen, I just wanted to say something about the relationship between me as a contemporary artist and using Hebrew type, and how I really want to make sure that the type is contemporary in feel and fresh and not harking back to the past, because there's a certain kind of field of Judaic art that I don't want to be inserted into, because it's more commercially oriented, and I feel like my art has a different aspect, or a different I want to say something different about these elements of Judaism, and I'm looking at my Jewish tradition in a fresh light, and it's almost like I'm doing commentary with my art. And so because of all that, I'm very careful in the kind of, I do look through type books to look at calligraphy, to look at typography, and I specifically choose each typeface for each project, unless I create my own typeface.
Do you have the sense that it's inescapable that your art is commentary on that tradition somehow? I mean, that was a really
in a good way.
Yeah,
In a good way. I want. I'm putting forth ideas, and I'm putting forth my own spin on my tradition. So I really do want that to be my stamp. That it's not. I'm not kind of playing it safe with my artwork.
thank you. Shani or Lynn, what do you think about this?
I also make to vote for about 24 years, sort of when I was in grad school, and it was sometimes marriage therapy. You might find that, Noam, when you're working with a couple, but I was also in grad school at the same time, and I started thinking about a ketubah as sort of like word and image as a kind of integration. And in grad school, I wasn't doing anything that was that had Jewish subject matter. And then I thought, well, why not? Why am I staying away from that? There are things that I can say that I'm thinking about. So I did start, and I actually started with a book called Midrash, which was sort of breaking down each Hebrew letter, drawing it, and then finding a kind of just some way of thinking about it. So I've been working with letters for a long time, and I just, if you go into a museum and you look at wonderful Japanese scroll painting that is calligraphic, I don't know what it means. I know it's beautiful. I know it's conveying a message. So sometimes I feel we get sort of pushed into a corner with what we're doing, when it should be just another part of a larger conversation.
I can maybe add from a different perspective, I think, that being a type designer for Hebrew, for Yiddish, working with the Hebrew script, and having all the tools that are needed for that, is basically kind of compensating for this very challenging process, very rushed evolution of Hebrew type and typography. So in a sense, what I'm trying to do, and definitely trying to share and talk to students about, is to reconnect Hebrew type to the Hebrew script. You need to understand how the letter is written. You need to understand the tool that you're using, and only then, with this full understanding of the ductus and what is the right structure of the letter, only then you can start moving it into type design, into building that system that would function in our contemporary usage, and do it to the best level that it can. So in a way, kind of advancing, let's say, the quality of Hebrew type these days is mostly, to my opinion, going back and connecting it with the writing, with the way that Hebrew letters should look like, in contrary to the a lot of products that we've seen, which is basically copying shapes without really understanding the script and the correct structure of the letters.
I'm going to try to connect what both of you are saying to the next question that I want to ask, which is something about this connection between word and image. Because Shani, you're talking about the structure of the printed letter as it relates to the structure of the drawn letter in essence, which could be an image, but also could be, you know, a sign. But Lynne, you are also talking about word and image as they're combined in Japanese as well as Japanese works, but also works with Hebrew letters. And so I'm wondering how all of you think about, in the visual work that you do, let's say rhyming the Hebrew letters with the rest of the work. Not necessarily harmonizing, it could be a slant rhyme, but you know, how does that visual element of the Hebrew letter, which is also a sign, how do you think about working it into the rest of what you're creating?
I think that every time that you sit down with any kind of visual material, everything has to be incorporated into a single image, so that there's nothing that there's nothing that's being worked on in, you know, it's an entity, it's the whole. And so there's no kind of project where you're going to just slap on some kind of typography and move on. I mean, every element is so carefully considered to make that composition work, to make it sing. So for every, I mean, I go to the extent of creating my own typeface if I need to, because it needs to work within that composition. And actually this letterpress opportunity that Robyn has created, I'm so excited to be able to use fonts that have been created for me and create a piece around that. I'm really excited. And in fact, Lynne, I'm going to be using I'm actually inspired by the Japanese scrolls with the typography going down. So I'm going to be using kind of an acrostic idea with typography going down in Hebrew as well, because I have this opportunity of using type that I don't have to create anymore. I just wanted to pop that in there.
Great. And while you were talking, I realized I wanted to add another wrinkle to this question as we, you know, circulate it. And that is there something specific about using Hebrew in this case to create the word image composition or the integrated composition that you're talking about? Especially because the forms of Hebrew letters have such significance in terms of how the positive and negative spaces are taking on meaning. Do you all think about anything in particular having to do with Hebrew when you're creating these hybrid compositions?
Well, I think yes, because we're choosing to work with these letters. I mean, the circular pieces that I showed you sort of evolved from thinking about these Jewish women who were setting type. And why do we know? Because they set their names in the colophons, and we know so little about Jewish women, even though with Eshet Chayil, you know that they're literally doing everything to keep a household running. So I feel like, okay, I'm a Jewish woman, I'm setting type, and I'm in 2022, and I'm working in a contemporary way with these beautiful forms that are part of my tradition and culture. So that's it for me.
Also, just to explain what Lynn mentioned, this Esha Chayil is a prayer that talks about the woman of valor and basically how much she does all the time.
All the time.
I think maybe it might sound obvious, but I was just thinking of the many times I was seeing or encountering various works that use the Hebrew type, and obviously it was used by non-speakers. So they would use Hebrew letters, and you know that they can't read them because they either make no sense or they make sense, and it's really horrible. And I'm thinking, you know, the lowest kind of, you know, I'm thinking about tattoos or, you know, maybe more mundane things. And I think this is where maybe we should all be extra sensitive when we're working with type as image in any script, right? Because we can read it, other people can't. It definitely adds another layer. It's not just a visual thing. And maybe you can stretch that level of readability for your artistic reasons or for the effect that you're looking for. But if there's text there, we can read it. And I think that's maybe this is what we're actually looking for when we're working with text and image, this kind of tension between it.
Anything from you, Noam, or would you like another question?
Yeah, I also okay. Well, yeah, I'm open to more questions, and I see also there's a lot of questions in the chat. So I don't want to take up too much time. Yeah, so I'll say I'm open to more questions.
Well, I actually was going to have the next question be also a general question that came up in the chat from Barbara Mann about you know, the relation between Hebrew being sacred and secular, and how perhaps when you use it in your work, you're engaging with either or both of those contexts.
My work is specifically relating to the secular. I'm actually doing deep dives into questions that I have about Judaism, and questions that I want to answer with a visual and with the text. And I want to open up a door or open up a conversation with other people with these visuals. And so that's very, very important for me that that this kind of dialogue is initiated. And I have found that these religious discussions are actually, it's not just within my Jewish circles. The topics just kind of extend out to all kinds of religions. And I've had work hanging in the Abrahamic Center, which is a Muslim place, and I've had them hanging in churches because there's a certain universality to some of the questions that Judaism raises, that it's so beautiful that we can all have these discussions that are pretty profound about who we are in relation to this world.
So are you taking secular to mean sort of multi-faith? Because I mean, it seems like a lot of the topics you're dealing with are coming out of liturgical situations.
Did I misspeak? Did I say secular and I meant religious?
Oh, okay.
I'm sorry, I misspoke. I meant that they're supposed to be religious works. I mean, they're not secular. They're really I'm looking into my religion and I'm asking religious questions. I'm sorry.
It's okay. I just wanted to understand, and yeah, I was thinking it seemed pretty religious. Or now this is an interesting question too, whether it's about religion or in the question that Barbara was asking is about sacredness.
Yeah, and I think something that is so interesting to me about just Jewish book history in general, and I alluded to this very briefly, is that the same Hebrew letters, the same script or the same type. I mean, this is not unique to Hebrew. Obviously, this is true for Latin or for any other language. But the same printer, in the 17th century, they could be printing Hebrew Bibles. They could be printing a newspaper, they could be printing commentary, they could be printing moralistic works in the vernacular language in Yiddish or in Judeo-Spanish. They could be printing folk tales. I mean, so the combination and recombination of these letters has the potential to create all of these different layers of conversation and textual, between texts and between traditions and across traditions. So it's kind of there. All that potential is there, and it's kind of in our toolbox to recreate it in different contexts. So I think when we do that, we're acting in this longer tradition.
But I do think the letters are, the Hebrew letters are loaded in a sense. You can't kind of escape where they first began and why. So yes, they have as a living language, they're conversational. They make conversational words, but I just you have that connection to how they began. At least that's powerful for me.
That doubleness also comes up in one of the questions about Yiddish, and I'm wondering if Shani, you can talk about the Yiddish type also that's in the collection, or maybe it's in the Minnesota for Book Arts collection as well, Center for Book Arts. But that could be more of the secular wing of the sacred secular dynamic.
I'm trying to think how to compress this answer, because this is such a huge topic. Firstly, the newly cut wood type from Hamilton. The patterns are the same historical patterns probably that were used for some of the, I'm assuming some of the wood type that we have in the collection. The design is identical. That's what I've been able to discover through my research and my analysis. And again, technically speaking, as a type designer with context of type design, there's some challenges for that typeface. I've been spending a lot of time to try and understand what is the difference between a Hebrew typeface and a Yiddish typeface. In the context of the years that the Hebrew wood type was used. And I have I have some information, I have many questions, I have a lot of thoughts and nothing really conclusive, because we simply don't have enough resources to actually know for sure. My best guess is that they were used for both, and if specifically serving the Jewish immigrants community in the States, it was mostly Yiddish as a vernacular language, right? Because it's large wood type, it was made for posters, for broadsides, it was ephemeral, it was secular, even if it was, you know, promoting an event, a religious event in the synagogue. That means of communication was a poster that you would hang and then you would throw away. And this is exactly the reason that whenever we are able to reach those historical material that survived, there is so much work that we could do to kind of try and harvest the data from them. I always say that my favorite and my most frustrating question when I'm looking at those kind of resources is, what am I not seeing? What should be here and it's not, and why? So there could be many explanations. I have a whole, you know, a very long kind of process and insight into the whole issue of the nikud, the vowel marks, which you were able to cut because you had the patterns in Hamilton. But from what I've been looking for, I only found one tray at the Yiddish Book Center in Amherst, one complete tray of just the vowel marks, which are teeny tiny pieces of wood that would make absolutely no sense to someone who's not familiar with specifically typesetting in Hebrew. And even that is not necessarily true, because as we see in printing, all the way until today, mostly in Hebrew, but also in Yiddish, the use of the nikud, of the vowel marks, is slowly disappearing because it wasn't technically an easy thing to do, just because of the production. And then the readers had to adjust and kind of, you know, learn the language by knowing it, right? Reading and understanding by the context. So I wish I could tell you what are the sets were used for. I can go on, you know, in more detail about what the differences are. But I think the best guess is that it was used for both, and from, you know, the more day-to-day ephemeral application, I think it was mostly Yiddish. It still was a long answer, I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. And, you know, I'm thinking about how one detail of it about how those vowel marks work. It's not only something I want to comment on because maybe some folks in the Zoom don't know about the vowel marks, but also because it requires some knowledge, as you said, of printing technology, letterpress especially. So vowels and consonants are not like in Latin where they're equally characters in the same line, but in Hebrew, the vowels sounds are dots and dashes, basically, that annotate the larger characters. But printing can happen without those vowels. And it's easier to make printing happen without those vowels in older technologies. And so I think this actually relates to Anne Ginsberg Hofkin's question, which is about how all of the things that we've been talking about tonight can be made available to folks who don't know so much, either about Hebrew or about printing. Like, how can your work speak maybe beyond a Jewish context or beyond perhaps a printing context, to open the conversation to people who are curious, but perhaps, as she says, not schooled in this realm.
I think maybe it's easiest for me to answer this question because I'm lucky enough to work in a rare library that is also like a living museum or a living collection. I think that if you go to the Carey Collection website and you look into our YouTube channel, you can find many talks that we've hosted. Lynne's talk is also there about her work with the collection. There are many talks about the collection that I've I can share online. And I think that the fact that all the collection is online, at least visually, so it's not necessarily an in-depth experience, but just even looking at the images or downloading the PDF of the type of the galleys and then their proofs could be an experience if someone is looking to dive into that. So in that sense, I feel very lucky and very happy that in the Carey collection we are invested in, in this type of education, and we are currently under construction, but we're very looking forward to having our press room running and our collections open again. So expect more programming, more workshops, and that are definitely open and made for the public, not specifically Hebrew speakers and not specifically Jewish.
And in my other part of my life, I run a letterpress print shop and a nonprofit arts organization in Detroit called Signal Return. And so we do teach workshops just like Minnesota Center for Book Arts, and we find people are actually really interested in working with their hands directly, with type, in control of the message, able to print it in multiple. And most people are not artists. They just really want to work together and connect with an older traditional way of making a message. So those places are out there. Center for Book Arts in New York, San Francisco Center for Book Arts. I don't know where people are, but the best way to learn is to do it yourself.
And I know that we're coming to the end of our time, so I just want to say that you all have done it yourselves by signing on to this Zoom. And I know that we need a few moments to let Robyn and Kirsten wrap up. So I'm sad to say that we're short. We don't have the chance to talk more because there are plenty of other things that we could talk about. But I appreciate hearing from all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so very much. I am personally filled with such inspiration and gratitude to our panelists for sharing about your amazing works and your process, and to Karen for moderating and shaping such a rich and thoughtful discussion. Thank you to Kirsten again and the wonderful staff at MCBA, and to all of our community partners and supporters who helped make tonight's event possible. And I also want to thank everyone who joined us this evening for your great questions and your interest and curiosity and sharing your knowledge with us. The chat was a really fun place to be while this conversation was happening. It was like two separate but joint conversations. So thank you for all of your contributions in that way. We hope that this sparks your interest in printing with MCBA's new Hebrew type, and diving deeper into the relationship between word and image, or word as image, and to amplify the quote from Shani, preservation through use. We all have the ability for this now. And I just want to invite you all to MCBA if you're local, or maybe you'll be in town, to experience this type, because we are creating the history of it together.